Good morning. My first time in Toronto, first time in Canada, being liberated from the States. So just brief introduction. Thank you, Alec, for having me and company. I'm super excited to be here. Originally I am from Chicago, and I've done a lot of work in Chicago working with men in prostitution, people in addictions, people in homelessness, and then went to Princeton and UPenn, where I worked a lot with undergraduate women there. And then shortly after that, went back into trauma and addictions counseling. And how I got into UX research and design was I had a mentor really encourage me to find a creative hobby with a beginning and an end. Because in counseling, it never ends, it never stops. So something where I could start, stop something, and move on. Long story short, that's how I discovered UX research, have been in love with it ever since. And really, I find that there's a lot of overlap between what we do as UX researchers and what counselors do. We are responsible for crafting positive experiences. One of the main reasons why people don't go back to counseling is because they had a really shitty experience. And you have to walk into this space and be vulnerable and be honest and be transparent. And so we're responsible for crafting that experience, for creating spaces where our participants and the people that we're working with can freely understand what's happening. They can think out loud, they can explain, they can discover new features and things within our products, using your powers for good. And a lot of that, again, ties into that power dynamic, where they come in, they understand that we are the researcher, and there's sometimes an unconscious desire for us to guide them towards a certain way. You know, if we want them to speak highly about a certain feature, if we're hoping that they're gonna affirm something. So using your power is only for good. Awareness of nonverbal cues. So these are things like tone, like body language. If you have a participant who comes in and they're slouched down, and they're always looking at the ground, being aware of those things so you can guide them back into what's happening and have them be present. Practicing empathy, which I'm gonna dive into in a little bit, and awareness of what you bring into the session. So that difficult conversation you just had with your boss. Things like white privilege. That argument that you had with your partner in the morning. And slowing down and being aware of what you're bringing into the session. And so when I made this career switch into UX research, I began to notice that, I began to sense that there's this deep sense of pride about practicing and understanding empathy. And pride for us is an occupational hazard. It blinds us from areas of weakness, areas of ignorance that can potentially harm our participants, but also affect the research and change the outcomes of the products and the experiences we're trying to create. And so I remember going to this design conference, and the speaker at the time was talking about war stories and things that had happened. And right out the gate, he starts by making fun of this participant who had different religious beliefs than him. And then went on and talked about this young researcher who was upset that him and his coworkers were kind of poking fun at this other researcher. And we have to be really careful with this pride that we have about understanding empathy, because it can become this marketing thing, this sexy word that we drop in our interviews, that we drop in our conversations with each other, and we don't pause long enough to understand what are the barriers to that. And in doing so, we can run the risk of confusing empathy for pity. I want to tell you the story of this well-meaning nonprofit, and they had heard about this village where women were walking for miles to get clean water. And so they came up with the solution of, well, we're gonna build a well. So they raise funds and money to build this well, $5,000+. They build the well and they leave. They come back 6 months later and they discover that no one is using the well. So super quick, turn to the person next to you. Why do you think the women weren't using the well? I'll give you 10, 15 seconds. Go. Don't be shy. Not today. Okay, let's bring it back in. So they asked them, why aren't you using the well? And the women said, well, that time when we walked to get the clean water was the only time of the day we were able to commune with each other and talk with each other. And so by building the well in the village, you've made us prisoners to our homes. So important, well-meaning, but when you assert pity, then you end up, oh, these poor women. Let me build a well. And in reality, you were causing harm to them. They had no idea. Really, they want something more like this. This is a hippo roller, something that you just fill with water, drag, pull. That way it takes off the strain and the pressure that was happening on their back and their necks. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar, and she interviewed a bunch of different professions where empathy was really important and key for what they were doing. And out of that, she found these 4 qualities of empathy. So perspective taking. Research shows that the more Judeo-white middle class you are, the harder this is for you. Because the majority perspective is often the most dominant. Whereas for minorities, especially in America, you're taught this at a very young age because it's about survival. You have to know when you walk into the room how many people look like you are there. You have to be aware of tone. It's something that's more natural. And if you talk to someone who's Black from the States, they'll often tell you that they had this conversation when they were a kid. So for me, I was 6 when my mom told me that. Staying out of judgment. So much easier said than done. But it's not just staying out of judgment when you're with your participant. It's about staying out of judgment when you leave that room. And this is often where I see it collapse. People are trying super hard not to judge the participant, but then once they leave the room, they just talk complete and utter shit about them. And that's not truly staying out of judgment. That's not genuine or authentic. Recognizing emotion in others. So, scientists say there are thousands of different emotions, but a lot of that too can be picked up on tone, can be picked up on body language, and being able to not only recognize that, but communicate that back to say that you understand what's happening. Interesting research is showing that people who use Botox a lot are showing to have lesser of ability to show empathy because they're not able to mimic the facial emotions that go with empathy. Now, shame and guilt are different, and we have to distinguish those two because empathy is all about human connection, and we have to talk about the things that break and disrupt that human connection. So guilt is about a specific behavior, whereas shame is about the self. Guilt is, I made a mistake, whereas shame is, I am the mistake. Guilt is, I've done something bad, and shame is, I am bad. And the reason why I'm giving this talk today is a little bit of kind of like what Alex said is I'm really just encouraging you to slow down and do a self-check. Especially because empathy is so important and we work so closely with people. It's important to understand and slow down and think about how do you interact with shame? How does that come up for you? What are the triggers? What are the messages? What are some of those lies that we believe? Dr. Brené Brown gave a TED Talk in 2002 called Listening to Shame. Please Google it, listen to it, it's a game changer. But interesting, she talks about how while we are all familiar with the warm wash of shame, the way that we experience it between men and women is different. So with women, she talks about how it's often this constant juggling of expectations that we put on ourselves, this pursuit of effortless perfection, crushing it on the job, great friend, great daughter, great project manager, researcher, and then when we feel like we're dropping one of those balls, that's when we start to experience shame. Whereas for men, it's not this juggling of all these expectations, it's one thing. Don't be perceived as weak. And that's usually when the warm wash of shame comes. And so while we might experience shame differently, and your upbringing and previous experiences definitely influence this. While we might experience it differently, there are oftentimes the same messages that we tell ourselves, that we hear. Things like, I'm not confident enough. I'm not creative enough. I'm not productive enough. I'm not qualified enough. And you have to be able to recognize these messages, especially if you're about to go into a study, you're about to present to your stakeholders, you are about to ask your boss for that promotion. All these things affect that relationship in that moment. It affects that experience. If you have a difficult conversation with your boss, you're struggling with feeling competent as a UX researcher, and then you go into a session, that is absolutely going to affect the research, how you read that, how you're even interacting with that person. And it's so, so incredibly important. And it's not just about understanding and recognizing the cognitive symptoms, because that's what this is, but it's also about recognizing the physical symptoms. When I did trauma counseling with children, often 7 and under, I would read them this book. And what I love about this book is it helps give vocabulary to children about what they're feeling. And it's the same thing for adults. So tingling, like a knot in the stomach, sweaty palms, rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath. These are things that happen when we start to experience shame. But also trauma. These are trauma physiological effects as well. And it's because the same part of your brain is activated when you experience shame as when you experience trauma. And as a UX researcher, it is not only your ethical responsibility, but your professional responsibility to understand your shame triggers and the messages that you tell yourself. And the reason for that is because it is going to affect and impact the relationship with your participant, the relationship with your research. It's so important for you to slow down and understand what those messages are and to think through, what do you do when that happens? Because we're all human beings. Like, I've experienced shame. We're pretty sure that the only people that don't experience shame are sociopaths. So I think it's okay if you admit that you experience shame every now and then. But what's also important to remember is that emotions, especially shame, is contagious. So transference and countertransference are common, meaning that your participants can catch the shame and vice versa. And as a UX researcher, it is also your ethical and professional responsibility to recognize when your participants might be experiencing shame. Because it's your responsibility to learn and know how to shepherd them out of that, so they can be present, be more transparent, be honest, and feel safe enough to be vulnerable with you. Brené Brown's research surfaces 3 common reactions to shame. So there's move against, which is attacking others or attacking yourself. So this is when your participant is doing something and they're like, sorry, I'm just really stupid. Or, God, I'm an idiot, I'm a klutz. That's why that happened. Or when you do it, you're giving a presentation. I'm sorry, I don't know what I was talking about. Yeah, I don't really know. I'm sorry. Moving away. I see this a lot. I can see this in my session when at first my participant is like super excited to be there. They're really engaging, and then there's like a certain question that's asked, or maybe a certain memory's been triggered, and they start to be shorter and shorter. They're not maybe as engaged as they were before. Moving towards, so pleasing others or perfectionism. This is especially doing studies at Google of putting this this persona on of like, I got all my shit together, let's do this. Was there anything like difficult? Nope, crushed it. Okay. And really the antidote isn't super complex. I'm not sharing anything super profound, but it's really this idea and understanding that shame will always need to be countered with perspective. Because shame is about perspective, how we're interpreting things, how we're reading things, how we're seeing things. It's about introducing vulnerability and empathy. You know, when I made the career switch into UX research, I enjoyed how much we talked about empathy, but I was shocked at how little we talked about vulnerability. You can't be empathetic without vulnerability. Like, why is it that we're not talking about that more? Like, I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of conversations about empathy can be complete and utter bullshit. Because it's this idea of, we tell each other, it's about understanding your user. It's about stepping in their shoes. But then we don't talk about what's actually required of you to do that. So if you think that you can recognize emotion in someone else without thinking about a time or even recognizing when you've experienced that emotion, how are you going to be able to communicate that back to them? It's about, with perspective taking, to be vulnerable and honest enough with yourself to want to also recognize when you're judging them. Or to be vulnerable to admit, like, yeah, like, you know, I don't know. Like, it actually takes vulnerability for you to say those words. I don't know. And that's incredibly important. It's a way that we can also guard ourselves against pride. So let me tease out a little bit about what that looks like between the participant and shame. So moving against. Speaking from the perspective of being in the States, we do arts and crafts and stuff as a kid. And then by the time we get into like 6th or 7th grade, we start being graded for it. And what's interesting is a lot of people, when they're young, think they're super creative. You know, they're drawing a giraffe with like wings and like a top hat. But after middle school, we start to say like, oh, well, I'm not creative. Oh, I'm not artistic. Because we start to get graded on it. So I had this participant once where I had cut up like different modules of information and had encouraged him to like, you know, rearrange it. I was like, you are the designer for the day. If you want, you can draw. And as soon as I said that, he was like, no, I'm not an artist. And he just completely like shut down. And I was like, now I could have responded and been like, well, that's okay, try anyways. No empathy, no connection. But instead, you know, and Brene Brown talks about this too, the greatest words when we're in struggle is me too. So instead I was like, yeah, man, like totally get it, like same here. I was like, can I show you what I tried to do the other day? And he's like, yeah, sure. So I draw this like super crappy picture, because it was crappy. I was like, yeah, man, let me show you what I did the other day. So I draw this crappy picture, and we're laughing and we're joking about it. And in that moment, he felt a lot more safer to then draw and like show me his idea. Because there was a moment where we could connect and be like, yeah, me too. Move away. And again, like that was, a lot of that was kind of in there too. And part of that is, you know, how do you show someone that like they're not alone in that moment? Because that's a lot of the reason why we withdraw. We feel alone. So we're like, well, let me just solidify this and actually truly be alone. I remember I had a participant who, for moving toward, so like perfectionism, trying to be super pleasing. And she was looking for a job, just finished med school, super pumped, could not stop talking about her like 10.9 GPA, all the recommendations she got, how proud her family was of her. She's like, yeah, no, I'm looking for work. And, you know, as having a counseling background, using my powers for good, I can pick up on sort of these things. And so I said to her, I was like, you know, I've been there looking for a job. Like, it is tough. I was like, it is tough, but it gets better. And in that moment, like, guards went down, was talking about how it's been a struggle for her. We're talking about this on our way to the room where we're going to be having our session. You know, this type of stuff doesn't just begin when you're in the room with the participant. It's even as you're walking with them to the session. Like, that's when it starts. If you wait until you're in the room, running a study and asking questions, you've already missed an opportunity. That connection, being able to balance the playing field of, hey, like, me and you are here. There's no this. Like, we're here. We're just two people talking about Google Maps or whatever. you know, what you do typically for fun. Shame and the UX researcher. So there's always a temptation of me to like spend like 10, 15 minutes going into, this is what I think should happen. But you know, I'm reminded about a story with my mom. You need to know, like, my mom is like a super intense person. Like, she does not F around. When I got in trouble as a kid, I did book reports. And I couldn't leave the house until the book report was done. And I remember when I was 7, this is a true story, I was 7 years old, and my mom was like, you know what, Vivianne, you need to take more initiative with your life. I'm 7. And so I told her, I don't know what initiative means. So we got in the car, she drove me to the store, bought me a kid's dictionary, drove home, and then told me to look it up. And then told me to write a paper about how I can take more initiative in my life. And I was grounded until it was done. So many stories, we don't even have time. And so basically, I'm not going to lay out all the things you can do. I will give you some things, but as a professional UX researcher, like, it is your responsibility to take initiative and to think through, how do you handle shame? What's the difference between that and guilt? What are the things that you bring into the room with your participant? What are the things you bring into your research? And you know, there's a reason why if you're going into professional counseling, you have to go and do counseling yourself. I'm always terrified when I meet people who are trying to become professional counselors, and they're like, yeah, I haven't done counseling and I don't need to do it. Also, if you're going to counseling, ask your counselor if they've done counseling themselves. This is for free. Just ask them. And if they haven't, just swerve. Some challenges, though, for you this week is to do some of this self-reflection. I would encourage you to think about, what are the common ways that you respond to shame within the workplace, outside the workplace? Before you sit with a participant or do a study, I would encourage you to even just take 5, 10 minutes before you enter into that and ask yourself a list of questions. What am I bringing into the session today? That's just simple. And even just by writing it down, you're releasing that power over you. Studies show that like journaling is actually helpful. To write something down and talk about your experience lessens that power it has over you. Do a checklist. What are the things I'm bringing in? You know, I would also encourage you to think about and have conversations about, you know, what is my code of ethics as a UX researcher, and how does shame and guilt play a part in that? To go back and think through, what are times where I have left either my privilege unchecked, where I've left my insecurities unchecked, and how did that affect how I read something? Ask yourself these tough questions. And, you know, begin by writing your own code of ethics. And really, you know, at the end of the day, like, we can leave this room, we can be like, wow, that was really insightful and cute, and I really appreciate this talk. But again, it's your responsibility to leave and then to continue wrestling, especially as UX researchers, because we work so closely with people. Like, you have to do this. Otherwise, the way we talk about empathy becomes incredibly cheap. And I'll leave you with this. Brené Brown has this quote that I absolutely love, and she says, you have comfort and you have courage, but you can't have both at the same time. Choose. So my hope for you today is that you would continue between comfort and courage to choose courage and do the internal self-work that needs to be done in order for you to be the best researcher you can be. Thank you.